Good afternoon. It's June 4th, a bit after 2 p.m. in the Netherlands and other parts of Western Europe. Welcome to the Balie, and to those of you who are watching this from their homes, their boats, their swimming pools, also a warm welcome. This is going to be a program about letters, literature and democracy, and we will see in the next 90 minutes or so what these things have in common. I have to start with a few technicalities. First of all, I have to give you some bad news. And as you know, bad news always comes in 3 installments, so be prepared. The first thing you should know is that Oksana Zabuzhko is not physically here. She will be here via Zoom. So this is unfortunate, but it's better than nothing. And we are very glad that this worked out. The second thing is that Drago Jancar was supposed to be here, but he had an accident on his way to the airport. There was one accident. He's alive and kicking. He's coming later. He's alive, that's the best part. He's alive and kicking. He will be coming to the Netherlands later, but he cannot make it to this program. So instead, that's very unfortunate. If you came here for Drago and you want to leave, I understand. And we tried our best also to establish a Zoom connection with him. But despite the connections that the Balie has with both the CIA and the Mossad, this didn't work. So what can you expect in the next 90 minutes? First, I will talk with Oksana for about 30 minutes, also to not deprive you from the presence of Drago totally. I will read about 4 or 5 minutes of his letter that was published in NRC in Dutch this weekend, and that can be found also on the website of Vox Europe. Then there's a small break, don't leave, it's just 2 minutes. And then after that I will talk with the two other authors, Lana Bastašić and Kamel Daoud. Now the last part of the technicality, you all got a headphone. If you want to listen to this conversation in French, the channel is 25. Si vous voulez entendre la conversation en français, le numéro sur votre casque est 25. And later, if you want to listen in English, the number is 1. That's only for the second part of the conversation. So now I start with introducing Oksana Zabuzhko. Oksana, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect.
I'm very much here.
Okay. I'm very glad that you are here. I will introduce you, and if I make a mistake, if you disagree with something, I'm going to say, interrupt me.
I'll be screaming, yes.
Okay. Oksana Zabuzhko was born in 1960 and is a Ukrainian novelist, poet, and essayist. She was born in Lutsk and studied philosophy at the Kiev Shevchenko University, where she also completed her PhD in aesthetics in 1987. She has worked as a research associate for the Institute of Philosophy of the Ukrainian Academy of Science, lectured in the US on Ukrainian culture, and worked as a columnist for some of the Ukraine's major journals. After the publication of her novel, Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, 1996, in which she explores the challenges and struggles of gender equality in a post-Soviet society, she has been living as a freelance author. Oksana, this is all more or less correct?
Yes, everything fits.
Perfect. Let me start asking you, where exactly are you now? Are you in Ukraine?
Yes, I am in Ukraine. Not in Kiev, not in my native Kiev, but in Lviv, in the western part of the country. It's a rear city, so it's relatively safe. But if we are interrupted with some air raid siren, so don't you worry, I'll be here. I'm not going to run to the shelter.
That's very brave of you. Yeah.
No, it's normal. I mean, you learn after 15 months, you learn how to live with that. And, Lviv, unlike Kyiv or Kharkiv or Bakhmut or other cities, in the front zone is relatively safe.
Yeah. No, I remember I went to Lviv and Odessa in September, and people there already told me then that they used the air raid sirens just to get a smoke and a cigarette.
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly.
I was the only one in the shelter, so I never did it again. I want to start with a quote that from your letter. that surprised me. And your beautiful letter, and written with lots of passion. You wrote in the letter, your letter, meaning my letter, stirred up in me a nostalgia for the world that no longer exists. For my own youth, for the euphoria still hot in the air of the Berlin Wall coming down and the Soviet Union collapsing. For the all-conquering faith we held that a renewed Europe would finally show the world the end of history. Fukuyama had promised that even old-age tyrannies like Russia and China were about to achieve liberal democracy, having seen what a great good it is. That the wolf would lie down with the lamb, and those who wanted to kill you would agree instead to have dinner with you, won over by the great gesture of your invitation. Wasn't this, I mean, of course I sympathize wholeheartedly with this feeling, but wasn't it also back then a bit naive to think that Fukuyama was right, and that the end of history with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union had come to us, to all of the world?
Well, but I mean, that's the spirit of the 90s. And I'm sorry to say that, Arnon, but these are the sweet memories of the long-forgotten world of hope, which your letter awoke in me. So I just shared, my immediate emotional reaction. Yeah, I remember this world in which you believe you could have a dinner. That was a reference, to your statement. I understand. I mean, it's very provocative and probably intentionally so intended to be provocative. But in fact, I was kind of taken aback, with this idea that yes, I can have a dinner with someone who wants to kill me. And since, I've been, in the country subjected to this colonial genocidal war, and I know only too well what it is like, not only from Bucha or, Mariupol or Irpin, all these, places now covered with mass graves, what it is like, when someone wants to kill you.
Yeah.
To me, it did resonate, this brave statement, I can have a dinner with someone who wants to kill you. No, they are not going to have a dinner with you, and they won't be overwhelmed with the generosity of your proposal. And that's the whole problem. That's the end of dialogue. Because having dinner, implies that, yes, you can have a conversation. Why you have dinner? Why you share dinner? Dinner is a sign of certain safety, and it is not enough to have the policeman or to be protected by law, as you put it, to have a normal dinner. Dinner implies sharing food with someone, implies, sharing a conversation and being wrapped, in a certain, in some atmosphere of safety and trust. And if someone wants to kill you, it's beyond this atmosphere of trust and safety. It is not about having dinner. It's totally different reality. And for me, it immediately caused these references, this hopes that yes, this former dictatorship can be turned into democracies. Through trade, Wandel durch Handel, this, German, the motto of German decision makers for many years of encouraging, Putin into building his postmodern FSB root empire. So it is all about, this Fukuyama belief. It's all about this 90s, this atmosphere of this politically naive 90s, and I do remember this atmosphere. So,
yes.
So you did. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm sorry. Don't take it personal.
No.
But it was you who started the provocation. And yes, I mean, it was your statements that resonated in me with this kind of preserved beliefs from the 90s.
Yeah, it was
the
not
Europe of the 90s.
Of course.
And now we have Europe united, and no more wars, and never again. And and we are going to teach the rest of the world, how to live peacefully and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you quoted it.
No,
right?
but I agree. It was not meant as a provocation, by the way. What I meant is that and maybe you can speak a bit more about it, that as long as it just remains an intention, you may sit down and break bread or have a glass of wine with your enemies. If you never sit down with your enemies, there are only two options. You must kill them, or at a certain point, you must achieve some way of peace, no? And in order to achieve that, you must sit down, and why not have dinner if you sit down? So that's my first question. Is it possible to sit down with your enemies, and is the forgiveness possible? And also maybe, because there was, I don't want to remain too long in the 90s, but even then there were people who criticized Fukuyama for being overly naive and for being overly optimistic. We were not all Fukuyamas even then. But let's focus on the enemy. Is it possible to sit down with your enemy and say enough is enough?
As long as he is conquered, and as long as he stops to aspire to kill you, yes.
Yes. So, but he must be first conquered.
But not until he is in the process of plotting how to kill you.
Yeah. There's another sentence which I liked and I'd like to quote to you in your letter. You wrote, "I could not agree with you more when you write that a writer must not do the work of evangelizing unless they are forced to do so by historical circumstances toxic to humanity, such as war, tyranny, etc." But isn't there war is always around, if not in Europe, in other places. If I take this statement literally, then when has a writer time to write and not busy himself with a task of propaganda or of propaganda? Because that's the risk, no? If I may use that word. It's not a provocation, by the way.
Well, yes, but I mean, it's your personal choice. Your writers and person's choice. I mean, whether it is your war or somebody else's, whether you take it as your war and your personal responsibility. And when you see that some of the crucial values you stand for are attacked, and that's what that's been my point in my entire letter. That yes, I mean, how can you discuss now the future of Europe, totally missing the fact that the battle for Europe is now being conducted on the scale unseen since 1945. So you cannot skip this war that is now happening on the threshold of the EU, that is in my country, okay? By mere coincidence, it could have been in the Baltics, it could have been the Caucasus, it could have been elsewhere. Actually, it was an attempt to start it in the Caucasus, and it was swallowed by Europe back then in 2008. So it's only when the danger became really immediate, really on the threshold of the European house, that finally this new neo-Nazi empire has been noticed. And exactly the same mistakes as performed back in the 30s when the Western countries were pacifying Hitler, were repeated literally, copy-pasted literally in the past 20 years to help a new fascist empire, coming into being. So that's the problem. What does this whole story tells us about this system errors in the European democracy, and what does it teach us about the future? And yes, it is the war which you cannot, but I mean, I believe, my belief is that this is the war which is not, a local, by no means it is a local conflict, so to speak, which is happening somewhere else. Yeah, I mean, the wars are all over the globe, transpiring on a regular basis, and you choose, which of them are yours, which of them are not. I mean, you know this better. You were doing military service. I was not. But as a writer, of course, I mean, as a writer, George Orwell, went to fight for Catalonia, went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and it was his war. It was his personal choice, that of a writer and of a journalist back then, and of a citizen. And the examples like this are, numerous. And so it is personal. Yes, every time it is personal. It is either your war or not. And of course, there are situations like this. Is the problem with the genocidal war. It is that it is your war by the very fact that you were kind of sentenced to be a victim. When the aim of the war Russia launched against Ukraine is to destroy Ukraine as such. The aim was proclaimed quite clearly. So I must not exist in their idea. I mean, that's what I'm saying by, in this war, Jews are us, so to speak. Like in Srebrenica, there were Bosnians, and so that's the problem. Who is going to be the Jews in this century? Who is the next? Yeah. So that's a special.
I have a question for you about that, because not only I read your letter, but also I read your essay, a very interesting and lovely written essay. It's in Dutch called Mijn langste boektournee, in English My Longest Book Tour. And there are a few things, because you already mentioned the Jews, and then we go back to another question I have. In this essay you wrote, he, meaning Putin, has already told you straight to the face what he wants a dozen times. That there are no Ukrainians anymore, that we will disappear, cease to exist, like the Jews with Hitler. He even uses exactly the same wording, a final solution to the Ukrainian question. Yeah. How long are you, meaning the world, meaning Western Europe, are you going to pretend that you haven't heard that? And also in the letter and in this book, there are several metaphors, if I may use that word, to World War II, Anne Frank, Goebbels, Gestapo. Yeah. What's the purpose of this metaphor of using words and images and facts from World War II? Can we really compare the fate of the destiny of the Ukrainian people with the Jewish people during World War II? And isn't there a risk that if we use this metaphor so often, that we instrumentalize and politicize history? And maybe that we do injustice to history? I know it's a very complex question, and we are not going to solve it in the 30 minutes that we are having, or it's less now than 30 minutes remaining, yeah? But this is the genocidal war. I mean, and all its characteristics, which I don't have time, to dwell into right now. Well, they are genocidal war. I mean, there's been a number of international conferences held on the subject.
And of course, the closest metaphor to the genocidal, the model, of the genocidal war is Holocaust, only because it's unique in terms, first and foremost, of being best explored. So I would say you have this ideal model of the genocidal war, which you can use as a textbook. So I wouldn't say it's a metaphor. It's a sample. It's a sample which may differ, being applied, to different kinds of genocide. But yes, it is a sample, and in the case of, in the case of current Russia's war, they are copying Hitler. They are copying Nazis. And this is something about history which desperately calls for being reviewed. The participation of Stalin's Soviet Union in World War II being launched and in partition of the world with Hitler. So that's something that neither the Soviet Union nor Russian Federation as its successor have ever took any responsibility for. I would say the co-actor in launching the World War II, the Hitler's accomplice. I mean, that's something which had totally disappeared from the European textbooks. After 1945, everyone was so happy that it's over, that let's put the rest, under the carpet. And that's something that Putin took a full advantage of. And how this fascist ideology, how Russia in the past 30 years was copying with this envy, with this aesthetic envy for the Gestapo Hugo Boss uniforms, was copying Nazi Germany. My goodness, I mean, that's something the Western part of Europe. And here I'm using this, Westie against Ostie. Too bad Drago Jancar is not with us because, we were writing our letters independently from each other, but I'm sure you've noticed we wrote them in the same tune, yeah? So again, this, Westie and Ostie, you cannot but notice that the experience of the World War II in the western part, from the, this western zone of Europe, was very different from the bloodlands.
The bloodlands, Snyder's book, of course, but yeah, but still many Jews were transported to the east. But let's not dwell too long, although I really like the subject on World War II. I have a question. If you're serious that Putin equals in some way more or less Hitler, and that Russia is more or less, can be compared to Nazi Germany in 39, 41, yes, whatever date. You know how Hitler ended. The Red Army conquered Berlin, and that was the end of Hitler. So what's the consequence of this, of your words? If Russia is a fascist country, if Putin is the Hitler of, so what then, where does it end? Where will this war end? What's for you the logic end of it? Then you cannot say we leave Putin alone as long as he leaves Ukraine alone, because you compare him to Hitler.
Well, the story is more complicated because Germany was having 12 years of Nazism, and Russia has much longer history of the terrorists so to speak, Gestapo equivalent ruled terrorist state. The 4 generations of, uninterrupted terrorist state, well, that's quite something, and that's the experience underestimated in the western part of Europe. So I dare say, I left a hint to that in this essay of mine you referred to in The Longest Journey. And yes, it is the end of the 300 years long imperial cycle, and yes, it's the century-long collapse of the Russian Empire. So the collapse of the Russian Empire is inevitable. In fact, it already started. And being aware to that fact and somehow joining the efforts of the international community to make this collapse as soft and peaceful and as harmless, both for the people populating this entire grand and badly mismanaged territory, sparsely populated and very poorly managed, as well as for the rest of the world, to make it smooth, to make it as smooth and as peaceful as possible, not to somehow to prevent it into turning this whole territory into, this disorder, civil war, bellum omnium contra omnes, and so on and so forth, which is the most realistic prospect, because yes, the chaos is the most immediate prospect, for Russia nowadays. There is no civil society, and with the weakening of this, central power, of course, the collapse will be inevitable. So yeah, we are entering, this zone of turbulence, and I never fail to repeat, we have to fasten our seat belts. So that's my only recipe for the next 10 years.
Like today, what you're saying, but also in your book, in your essay, The Longest Book Tour, you have harsh words for the West, for the US, for the chicken Kiev speech of the Bush pair. But you don't mention, and I was wondering why in this essay the help of the West to Ukraine, of the US, of the UK, according to serious newspapers, I would say serious newspapers like the New York Times or the Guardian, the information Ukraine got from secret services in the UK, in US, are quite important in fighting Russia. Why did you omit all the help without neutralizing or without not acknowledging the bravery of the Ukrainian soldiers? I was wondering, why isn't this in your book? And also, is this a strange idea that, to me at least strange, that even parts of Germany and Poland are conquered by Russian neo-Nazis, and the Ukrainians are not safe there anymore, and then you make the statement that there are only two last safe havens in the world, Australia and Western Canada. I was wondering what's wrong with Eastern Canada, but that's not for now. So maybe there's too many questions at once, but let's start. Why? There is also this idea by serious analysts that the war between Ukraine and Russia is a proxy war between the West and the East, and you don't seem to acknowledge this, or you don't seem to take this position seriously. And also, how come that you omit the help that Ukraine is getting? Why isn't that important to you?
Well, and please don't forget European donkeys you've mentioned. We've completely omitted the Europeanness of the donkeys, and that's an interesting issue to be discussed. Alas, I understand we don't have time for that, as well as for many other questions. to begin with, why I have omitted the help, in my, which is important, yes. In my book, the answer is extremely simple, Arnon. The book was submitted to the publisher in June 2022. By June 2022, the West was still undecided whether to provide us with something really considerable or whether to wait, whether we are really, worth all the sweat. Sorry, that's really the case. I mean, it was not until the end of the past year that really, in fact, it's only now, as you can see, that we are having this protected sky over Kiev, something I've been screaming for in the European Parliament in Strasbourg on March 8, 2022. So no surprise I did not mention this help that we are getting now in the book, which was submitted to the publisher in summer. But now that you mentioned it, so that's, I would say, technical reason. Now that you mentioned it, this proxy war business, I'm sorry, this all comes from the Russian propaganda. I am not buying this for a very simple reason. This is the same story in which there is no room for Ukraine, in which Ukraine is still seen as the backyard of Russia. Sorry, not anymore. Time to redo your lectures in history. Time to go back to these maps of the 17th century and to see that Ukraine is there and Russia is not. As opposed to what Putin now is claiming in panic. So the story is really, I mean, I'm not buying this proxy business because it's just an offense, it totally excludes my country, as I would say, as an actor of history. It includes Ukrainian society as an actor of history from the game. But there is something else. There is. And yeah, I think we should talk about this a little bit, because that's more or less when I would say the crisis of the crisis of this lovely Fukuyama-believed world started. 1994, Budapest Memorandum. Budapest Memorandum, which, as it appeared 20 years later, when Putin annexed Crimea in violation of any international law, and actually did not get from the West the reaction as was supposed to be shown, as we believed, back in 1994. So that was a very interesting collision, a very interesting situation. Okay, in a newly independent country, no one knows much about, but okay, a newly independent country, internationally recognized, which is the holder of the third largest nuclear weapon store. And yes, we give it up to show our goodwill, to show our belief in democracy, in this Fukuyama world, in the world in which there will be no law and in which, the whole concept of the nuclear weapon will be outdated. Okay, we believed in the future. 1994, Budapest. And then 20 years after, it appeared that, yes, these guarantees, that we received, you never signed any treaties with Russia because, their words is good for nothing. But, I mean, yes, there were the signatures by Western powers. There were the UK, the US, later France and even China, yes, who guaranteed Ukraine the sovereignty and all the other nice things. So in a way, if we see now, this international aid that we are getting, to the honor of Bill Clinton be said. At least, he used this, repentance, repentant intonation recently, recognizing that, yes, Ukrainians were kind of, undecided and reluctant, our politicians of the time, because they were afraid of Russia. But, okay, the Western decision makers assured this stupid backyard that the old democracy, would take care of the order in our common global house. So the fact that Budapest Memorandum did not work in 2014, well, that was actually, I would say, something that was undermining the trust. We started with the trust, yeah?
Yes.
The trust as the basis, as the fundamental concept of this, international law and the order of peaceful coexistence established after World War II.
Okay, I'm going to, because also of the time, this is all very interesting. Speaking of nuclear weapons, in your book, in your essay, you make this interesting remark, a surprising remark to me, that maybe it's a joke, that you think that the state of the Russian army and the state of the Russian state that's so corrupt and so basically run down, that the nuclear weapons might be stolen and they might not even have any more nuclear weapons left. Maybe I take your joke too seriously, but if this is a more or less serious statement, what are your sources and what are you implying? That we maybe should use an atomic bomb to end the war?
Goodness, I mean... it was half joke, because last year, last spring, when everyone in the West was afraid of the Russia's nuclear weapon, Ukrainian nuclear specialists, those which were familiar, with how its condition used to be back in the Soviet times. They've published, lots of, briefings, materials in the Ukrainian social media, kind of to explain how the situation is and what can happen and what cannot. Like, some shit could happen, some tactical, they might still, have, and yes, they might use, some tactical nuclear weapon. And of course it is pretty unpleasant, but hey, it is not apocalypse. They are bluffing. Okay. They are bluffing. So there were explanations like how to store water and how to, instructions, and yes, we were having, Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe, and we know how to survive things like this. So it's not going to be any Hollywood movie. Whatever Russian propaganda says, they are bluffing. Don't forget, they are bluffing.
No Hollywood. Okay, that's clear, and I'm happy to hear that you also tend to make provocative jokes. That we have more in common than we might have thought. Let's go back, because the Russian neo-Nazis in Poland and Germany, and your statement, and maybe this is also ironic, but I took it again very seriously, that only Australia...
Russian-backed neo-Nazis.
Okay, Russian-backed neo-Nazis.
Russian-backed neo-Nazis.
How serious are you about it? Are you really thinking that Ukrainian refugees in Western Europe are not safe? And if so, what's your opinion based on?
It is not I'm serious. It is not I'm thinking. It's on the news. which you don't get in probably, in your part of Europe. But it's regular, it's something we are having on the news regularly, on a regular basis. Yes, here and there, the cafe kept by the Ukrainian refugees was attacked. Ukrainian children were attacked on their way back from home. And nowadays, there is a case, I don't remember the details, but in Berlin, there was a collision where the German police was staying aside and Ukrainians were beaten, by, they were beaten by this, by Germans of the Russian origin. So the things like this are happening on a regular basis, more or less, starting autumn 2022. So I'm sorry if this is the news for you, but
no.
Yes. But yes, this is the case.
I thought you were speaking about all of Western Europe, and I have to tell you, in Germany, the neo-Nazis, the really right-wing people there, they tend to attack asylum seekers anyhow, where they are coming from. So it might not even be directed only against Ukrainians.
I'm not saying only against Ukrainians. I'm saying that, yes, there is this lost sense of safety. And something that the state is unable to provide any longer.
But would you say this is also happening in, let's say, Paris, in Amsterdam, in Copenhagen, in London, or only Germany?
Well, I'm not. I just gave you a couple of examples which come from the Ukrainian news.
Okay.
So of course it is an anecdotal evidence. I'm not making any generalization, but yes, I don't. I think that. That something, a sense of security, a sense of safety, has been very much undermined in the past decade, in the Western Europe as well.
I totally agree, absolutely. I thought also, I'm looking what time it is. I would like to give the people in the audience the opportunity to ask questions. And as you might know, if you've been here before with me, I'm quite strict. The question doesn't last longer than 45 seconds and ends with a question mark. Jancar is going to walk around with a mic, say your name, and I guess Oksana will do her utmost to answer your question. No questions for... Wow. Oh, yes, in the back.
Is it possible for you to elaborate some more on the start of the discussion where you said, well, you can have dinner with an enemy like this, while in reality only an outcome without a lot of turmoil is possible at the time you sit at the table? You deny that?
Did you get the question? I'm not sure.
No, I haven't heard the word.
Can you repeat? Because I didn't even get the last. So the question is, okay. If the beginning of the conversation was about, can you have dinner with somebody who wants to kill you?
Exactly.
And then what was the second part of your question?
Can you say some more about this? Because in my opinion, it is impossible to come to an end of all these things without sitting at a table.
Okay.
It's inevitable.
Yeah, I got you. The gentleman is saying that that's unavoidable, that if you want to end war, this war or any war maybe, if I may say so, you have to sit down with your enemy. I guess...
Yes, but first we have to defeat our enemy. Only with the defeated enemy you can have a dinner.
Yeah. Only, Oksana said it before already, first defeat the enemy, then have dinner with him. It's very Old Testamentical, if I may say so. Yeah.
Thank you, I guess.
So can you actually hear me, or are you going to repeat it?
I will repeat it, if I can hear, yeah.
So thank you. My name is Thomas Tishar. From what I understand, the analysis is mostly that the war would likely end with not Ukraine taking back all of its land, although I understand why most Ukrainians will insist upon that. Would you see any possibility of once a war ends in defeat of Russia, that you would see it possible for Ukraine to give up certain amounts of land and therefore have peace, and therefore have that dinner to agree on certain amounts of land being given up?
Yeah, that's clear.
Not?
I'll repeat the question to you, Oksana. The gentleman, I'm not sure what you know, but it's not important. The gentleman asked, in his understanding, in his analysis, it's unavoidable that Ukraine won't get back all of the territories it lost in the last decades. So, and then the question is...
That we won't get back?
No, we just like Crimea or so, that's probably this an example. I'm looking at the gentleman. This will be Russia. So even...
Why?
Wait, let me finish, then you can answer. One second. Even under those circumstances, would you think, Oksana, it's possible to sit down with the Russians and to come to an agreement? Would you be willing to give up land for peace? We know this formula from the Middle East, but now maybe it's, yeah.
I would say that's very inhuman to ask writer to be an accomplice in something like this, because this territory is populated with the innocent people. In particular, if you speak about Crimea, this is the land of the Crimean Tatars, who fell the first prey of Russian repressions. And what is Russian occupation, you know, for the peoples who are sentenced to extermination? Well, go and read some history of the 20th century. So I don't understand why Crimea should be Russia. Absolutely. I mean, I don't see any reasons for that, any good reasons. No, absolutely no motivation, no rationale, totally and completely, you know, except for the imperialistic mythology cherished by the current Russian fascist government. And I don't think you have to cooperate with the fascist governments in any of their geopolitical fantasies. Okay. I guess I made myself quite clear.
Yeah. So if I can summarize your answer, first get the fuck out of all of Ukraine, and then maybe we can eat some potatoes. Maybe.
More or less like this, yes. And pay reparations and all the destructions they produced in the country.
Yeah. There's time for one last question. If not, there's a two. Can we do that too or not? Yeah, we can do.
Mine is short, I guess. Oksana mentioned the difference between Eastern and Western views, so Aussie and Wessie perspectives. If she could just elaborate a little bit on that. What are that difference between East and Western?
Oksana, the lady is asking, you mentioned the Aussie-Wessie thing, not only within the context of Germany, of course, but within the context of all of Europe, the former, the nation states that belonged
Drago did
under the influence. Yeah. So can you elaborate a bit on that? What's exactly the difference between, let's say, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, France?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate this question. Do I have 5 minutes at least to answer it? No?
Yeah, five or 4 minutes. Jante, what do we give Oksana? 5 minutes. Yeah, you get 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, because it is important. Yeah, and that's you know what I was trying somehow to. I just dropped it in my letter to Arnon, but of course, you know, it is the issue which deserves much more attention, much more time, and much more attention. Well, yes, the Europe which is still mentally, culturally, psychologically, I'm not saying economically, it's none of my business, I'm not good at that, divided along the same symbolic Berlin Wall, despite the fact that it's past, 30-something years since the Berlin Wall collapsed. And yes, the terms, like I was shocked actually to find out in Netherlands it was, that the term Eastern Bloc is still in usage in the textbooks, and the kids born in the 90s are using the same term, without an awareness that, yes, they use the term for the non-existent reality. But there is something, once there is a term, okay, there is a difference. And yes, this difference is not between, like old democracies and young democracies. It goes deeper than that. I would say it goes back to Marx or rather Hegel. It is this, what Hegel was dividing as historical and ahistorical, anti-historical nations. Historical nations were, of course, those which were having empires, which politically developed themselves into empires. And now that's the touchy issue. That makes a big difference. That's what helps, in my, humble opinion. I'm really missing Drago in this discussion
yes.
because that was his point, this proper West lecturing this new democracies, these recently joined countries from the former Eastern Bloc, so to speak, former Soviet bloc, or, okay, let's call it the former provinces or the former colonies of Austria-Hungarian Empire, yes. Hegelian anti-historical nations. So former empires against former colonies. And this big difference, in the mentality, not to speak of how it affected, this, I would say, this war maps of the 20th century. And yes, why for the Western, for this old West, so to speak, this former imperialist West, the World War I had been much deeper and more horrifying collective trauma than for Central and Eastern Europe. So the question is like, where is your still bleeding front?
Yeah.
Is it under Verdun or is it under Sandomierz? So that's really the difference, and it determines, as it proved in the course of the last 15 months, in the course of this, Russia's war against Ukraine, which is actually Russia's war against Europe. Yes.
Yeah. That's also. You're five. Yeah, we're already at 7 minutes. Forgive me. But,
I'm sorry.
No, that's
sorry.
fine.
I just warmed myself up.
You can find more about it in this book. We did the last question, and since Oksana mentioned Drago, I decided not to read any part of Drago's letter. But if you insist on this, you can come to my apartment later this evening. I'll do it in private for you. So come to me after the conversation. Yes.
Sorry, if I'm allowed, I want to add just 1 minute commentary on liberation for Ukrainian refugees about this lost sense of security, because I am myself a Ukrainian refugee from last year. Is it okay if I say something?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I understand what Oksana Zabuzhko said about lost sense of security, because when, for example, my experience here in the Netherlands was quite positive. I didn't see any like conflicts between Ukrainian refugees and, for example, Russian representatives. But what I feel and what other Ukrainians feel about this, for example, when we hear Russian language, we do not feel secure. And also, I think about that we do not see also Russians take a strong position in this Russian-Ukrainian war. We do not see them in Europe and also in the West in general striking against Putin regime and everything. We do not see this movement, and therefore I expect from them like everything, like every way, like how they react, and we can expect them something like in opposition to Putin, but also we can expect from them that they are supportive. So this silence makes it really, I think, dangerous in terms of this situation.
Yeah. You were saying that when you hear the Russian language, you don't feel secure, yes? Would you say that maybe it's a good idea for the EU to outlaw the Russian language?
No, I mean, in a sense, that Ukrainians and other people who fled from Ukraine from war, we, even being here physically, for example, in the Netherlands, we still possess ourselves that we are at war. Like, even though we are safe here, we do not hear like sirens here, there is no rockets, but still I outline, for example, Russians as my enemies, because they are killing, for example, my friends, people whom I know, who are serving the army, they are doing genocide in my country.
Yeah,
so they are my
clear.
enemies. Yeah.
The clear distinction between friends and enemies. Oksana, I'd like to thank you for your answers, for your sense of humor, and for your direct and passionate way of talking about a very sensitive issue. I hope that we will meet again in private once, and I'm not sure, but I'm willing to have dinner with you.
Invitation accepted.
Okay, accepted. That's good. We'll have a date. Hopefully soon, maybe in Kiev. Thank you.
We have a date, okay. You are welcome. Okay.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Okay.
Thank you.
Before we start with the second part of the conversation, I'd like to invite my two guests to come to the table. We listen to music. And to honor Drago, it's music from Slovenia. It's one of my favorite bands, Laibach. Okay, that was Laibach. Welcome to the second part. Again, a very small technical remark. If you don't speak French as good as Monsieur Macron, it might be wise to put on your headphones and listen to channel 1. Lana, warm welcome. Monsieur Daoud, je suis très heureux d'être ici avec vous. Et comme j'ai dit avant, je vous promets, la prochaine fois va être en anglais. En français. Et aussi, j'espère que vous êtes d'accord quand je dis en anglais Kamel au lieu de Monsieur Daoud.
Oui, c'est mon prénom.
Ah, okay. Parfait. I'm going to introduce the two guests. First, I will start with Lana Bastašić. Lana Bastašić is a Bosnian writer, and again, correct me if I make mistakes. Any, please. It's not, you're not doing exam, as you said before.
I love correcting white men from Western Europe, so don't worry about it.
Excuse me?
We're going to have a lot of fun.
Lana Bastašić is a Bosnian writer, novelist, and translator. She wrote several collections of short stories, poetry, and literary works. She was born in Zagreb, studied English at the University of Banja Luka, and received an MA in Cultural Studies from the University of Belgrade. After the Civil War, when she was 24, she moved to Ireland, and she gained international prominence with her first novel, Catch the Rabbit, Vang de Haas in Dutch, which is based on her own experiences as a young female in post-war Sarajevo. In 2020, she won the European Prize for Literature.
Okay, so you made 2 mistakes, which is not bad.
Okay, that's not bad. Please tell me.
So I never lived in Ireland, but that's not your mistake. That's somebody, for some reason, at some point, identified me with my narrator. So that's her story. And also, it's not Sarajevo, it's Banja Luka.
Banja Luka.
Yeah.
2 mistakes. Okay, that's.
But
next time I do better.
great.
No, next time.
It's good. Yeah.
Kamel Daoud, born in 1970, is an Algerian writer and journalist. He studied first mathematics and completed a master in literature. In 1994, he became editor of the Algerian newspaper Le Quotidien d'Oran, for which he writes a popular column. In 2015, he published his renowned debut, Meursault Contre-Enquête, the Meursault Investigation, which was the answer to the famous novel by Camus, L'Étranger. How many mistakes? I hope...
It's okay.
It's okay, no mistake. Wow, it's only with you I made it. I feel so bad. Lana, you in your letter to me, to the people, to the audience, I will quote from the beginning. I was going to write a completely different letter, but then life happened, or death. Same thing. I was in a bookshop in Berlin eating a cinnamon roll, because you can do that in bookshops now, and reading bell hooks when I heard that Dubravka Ogresic had died. I found out in the worst possible way through social media, although I'm not sure if there's a right way to find out your friend had passed away. I move around too much to have somebody close to me show up, look at me gravely, hold my hand and say, I've got some bad news. I don't know anyone in the city long enough to let them hold my hands. So I just sat there with my stupid cinnamon roll, holding in my hand a book about love and feeling outright rage. I'm not sure how many people in the audience know who Dubravka Ogresic was. A few, but maybe you can explain that later. But maybe what you don't know is I was there when she died.
Her brother told me.
And you knew this when you wrote this letter?
No, actually.
Okay, it was quite a shock for me to.
Yeah, I didn't know, and then I went back because it was such a shock for me that I barely read his email. I skimmed through it. And actually coming back here, I realized that you were also in Amsterdam, and I thought, you must have known her. And then I went back to my correspondence with Siniša Ogresic, and he wrote to me, Arnon was there as well. So I was doubly pleased to come here and meet you. And maybe later I will annoy you with a million questions. Yeah.
Could you say a bit why Dubravka was so, of course you try to explain it in a letter, and we'll get more to hear about it, but why? What did she mean to you? Why was he so important for you, and maybe also for other people from former Yugoslavia, not only from former Yugoslavia?
Thank you so much for this question. I'm always happy to talk about Dubravka and her work. To me, she was important in so many different ways. First, as a professional woman writer, because this is something that we did not really have in former Yugoslavia as role models to see. Our textbooks were mostly filled with men. There was one woman writer, but she wrote poetry for children. And I simply didn't know growing up that I could be a writer. She was a great role model, but also not just because she was a woman and a writer, but also in her writing. Her writing, to me, was very different from what the men of her generation were doing, that she could really show how style is political, how every book was something different.
Can you explain that?
Yeah.
Why? How? When does style become political?
Well, the fact that there's. I always say there are, to me, writers who, in a way, write to say something about themselves, and there are writers who write to say something about all of us. And I prefer the latter kind. And Dubravka was somebody who was writing to say something about all of us. So the idea of style as being something you're born with, something unchangeable, something that is proof of your genius, and no matter what you write about, everything will have that touch of God. This is something that, to me, her work stands against, because even though you can hear, obviously, you can see this is Dubravka's sentence, each of her books has its own voice. And she approached topics as problems to be solved in a literary way. Of course, nowadays, I don't want to make a generalization. There are many men who do that as well. I think Danilo Kish did that. But nowadays, I feel like we are still falling in love with, his sentence without asking whether that sentence should be in this book. And this is what she was very much aware of. So she was important for that as well. And the third reason she was important was, of course, that she was an outspoken anti-nationalist in a moment when nationalism was really swallowing my countries, and I can use this plural because on paper I have 3 nationalities. So yes, please, when you leave this panel, find Dubravka's books and read her, because she has to be read. Yeah.
Thank you. Kamel, by the way, I like that you used the word genius. I thought it had become a bit of a forbidden word, but apparently not, especially not when it's being said about women, I guess.
Yeah.
Balie. You wrote in your letter to me, Kamel, at the risk of being overly familiar or claiming to share ideas with people I've never met before on a subject that is too vast, I love the metaphor of Europe as a swingers club, and for several reasons. First of all, when one lives in a world that you call Arab, one experiences profoundly and violently the confusion between sexual freedom and freedom itself that we attribute to Europe. In the so-called Arab world, being liberated sometimes means not so much voting freely, but the freedom to kiss a loved one on the lips in public. So maybe before we start talking about democracy and about the protection from the state for the citizen, maybe we should talk about sexual revolution. Maybe the sexual revolution comes first, and then other changes will come. How important is the sexual part when speaking, talking, and thinking about freedom?
Merci. Je ne pense pas qu'il y a une hiérarchie dans la liberté, c'est-à-dire prendre la liberté sexuelle et après passer à la démocratie. Je pense que c'est la même question et c'est le même combat. Je ne parle pas exclusivement de liberté sexuelle, mais du droit de disposer de son propre corps, d'être propriétaire de son propre corps. Et je pense que c'est à la base de ce qu'on peut définir comme étant la démocratie. Je suis propriétaire de mon corps. C'est une question qui se pose pour l'homme dans ce que vous appelez le monde arabe, et c'est une question qui se pose de manière beaucoup plus tragique pour les femmes dans ce que vous appelez le monde arabe. Donc il n'y a pas de hiérarchie, il n'y a pas de liberté sexuelle, après viendra la démocratie. C'est la même chose. Si je dispose de mon corps, j'ai le droit de voter et j'ai le droit d'embrasser en même temps.
No hierarchy, you said, and owning. What exactly do you mean? When? At what point do we own our body, and when does the point start when we don't own it? At what point can you say? Would you say that you live in Algeria? Would you say that you live in a society where the majority of the people don't own their own body?
Généralement, les religions nous dépossèdent de nos corps. Les religions sont là pour intercéder entre nous et notre corps, sur la sexualité, sur l'hygiène, sur la façon de s'habiller, sur la façon de naître et même sur la façon d'être enterré. Donc, il y a déjà une dépossession de par la religion, grosso modo, que ce soit l'islam, la chrétienté ou d'autres religions. Il y a quelqu'un qui s'installe au milieu entre vous et votre corps et qui décide des choses. Mais quand on habite dans un pays qui a été colonisé, la dépossession est double. C'est un peu difficile d'expliquer peut-être ici, ou peut-être pas. Mais votre corps ne vous appartient pas par la religion, mais aussi par la politique. Il ne vous appartient pas par ceux qui décident au nom d'un Dieu, mais il ne vous appartient pas aussi par ceux qui parlent au nom du décolonisateur. Votre corps n'est pas votre propriété, il appartient à une histoire épique, à une épopée. En Algérie, nous sommes coincés entre deux grands champs, entre l'au-delà, c'est-à-dire ce qui va venir après la mort, et l'en-deçà, ce qui est venu avant votre naissance, qui est la guerre de décolonisation. Et on a l'impression qu'on est au milieu et que notre corps ne nous appartient pas. C'est-à-dire qu'il faut avoir le corps du martyr, du décolonisateur, c'est le corps sublimé, ou bien il faut perdre son corps pour aller au paradis, et donc de l'autre côté. Donc on est vraiment au milieu, et c'est comme si on était en plus. Donc la dépossession, elle est politique, mais elle est aussi religieuse, elle est culturelle, elle est sociale, et même elle est économique. Mais bon, ça c'est un autre débat.
Yeah. That's clear. It's all of these things.
Pardon. Et c'est encore plus grave pour les femmes. Parce qu'il y a une métaphore, enfin une façon de parler des femmes dans nos sociétés qui peut-être ici, qui a peut-être existé ici en Occident. Quand on voit une femme, on ne dit pas qui elle est, mais on dit qu'elle est la fille de qui, ou la femme de qui, ou la mère de qui. C'est-à-dire, elle n'est jamais propriétaire d'elle-même dans son propre corps, dans son autonomie. Elle est toujours dans un lien d'appartenance à quelqu'un d'autre. Et c'est un schéma qui se perpétue. Il est valable pour l'homme, mais il est beaucoup plus tragique pour les femmes.
Right. Also, that's clear. When I went to Lebanon 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago, I was told that if change is coming to the Middle East, it will start with women. So my first question is, would you say that, do you agree with this statement, this idea, that it has to start with women? Also, because of course you mentioned that it's more tragic, the whole oppression for women. And the second question, how much can you differentiate between the state and religion? I mean, in a state like Iran, it's clear that state and religion are have become more or less the same. How would you say that's in Algeria? What's the difference between the state, the government and the mosque? Is there a zone between them?
Très difficile de répondre d'une manière très courte. C'est pour ça que vous avez demandé si on avait 1 heure pour chaque réponse. Je suis tout à fait d'accord, et je l'ai toujours écrit, que tout changement dans le monde qu'on appelle arabe, ce n'est pas uniquement le Moyen-Orient, parce qu'il y a pire, il y a le Maghreb, c'est que tout changement commence avec la femme. J'ai toujours écrit que les hommes peuvent se rassembler, ça s'appelle une manifestation ou une émeute. Mais quand les femmes rejoignent la manifestation, ça s'appelle une révolution. Ça veut dire qu'il y a une demande de changement profond. Tant que le statut et la perception de la femme dans le monde que vous appelez arabe n'a pas changé, rien ne changera. Je le crois profondément. Je crois que nous sommes des sociétés unijambistes. Nous essayons de faire le 100 mètres avec une seule jambe. Et on ne peut pas faire ça. Quand on n'a pas résolu la question de la femme, on n'a pas résolu la question de la liberté, de la démocratie, du désir, de la sexualité, de la propriété aussi, et même de l'amour. Comment voulez-vous qu'on puisse aimer le monde alors que nous n'aimons pas celle qui vous donne le monde, qui vous offre le monde? La femme, c'est le miroir de l'homme. Et c'est un vrai miroir parce qu'on ne peut la rencontrer ou on ne peut s'accepter que si on accepte la femme. L'acte de naissance, d'aimer, d'embrasser. Donc, je ne vois pas de changement dans le monde qu'on appelle arabe tant qu'il n'y a pas de changement dans le statut de la femme. Je suis absolument convaincu de ça. Maintenant, pour la deuxième question, quelle est la différence entre la mosquée et le régime? Je suis quelqu'un qui croit que dans le monde arabe, grosso modo, les régimes sont théocratiques. Les régimes sont religieux. La religion reste le parti majoritaire, celle qui assure le contrat entre un dictateur et la population. Bon, bien sûr, les islamistes voudraient qu'il y ait une confusion encore plus grande, que la mosquée soit l'État. Et ça, c'est leur vœu. Ils y arrivent de temps à autre, ils y arrivent dans certains pays, ils y arrivent à moitié. C'est leur utopie, c'est leur vision politique de l'avenir. Les islamistes veulent un califat. Ils veulent une utopie islamiste, ils ne veulent pas autre chose. Moi, je ne crois pas à la compatibilité de l'islamisme et de la démocratie. C'est une illusion, c'est une facilité de réflexion, mais la réalité est là. Vous ne pouvez pas négocier avec quelqu'un qui vous dit « je suis la vérité, je suis Dieu ». Qu'est-ce qui va nous rester en termes de négociation? Absolument rien. Donc, on ne peut pas être dans une sorte de démocratie islamiste ou islamique. Je ne le crois absolument pas. C'est quelque chose que me reprocheront les intellectuels arabes installés en Occident, mais c'est une réalité. Quand on vit dans cette géographie, on finit par arriver à cette conclusion. Donc, tout le conservatisme qui existe dans le monde que vous appelez arabe se retrouve dans cette distance qu'il y a entre le régime et la mosquée. Plus ils se rapprochent, plus ils se soutiennent l'un l'autre, plus ils immobilisent la société, moins il y a de progression, moins il y a de réflexion, moins il y a de liberté. Parfois, ils se font la guerre, parfois, ils s'emprisonnent les uns les autres, mais c'est toujours sur le dos de la liberté. C'est un cycle fermé dans le monde que vous appelez arabe. On nous enferme dans un cycle qui nous dit quoi? C'est soit moi le dictateur, soit les islamistes. C'est-à-dire, c'est soit moi qui vous protège contre les islamistes, soit ce sont les islamistes qui vont vous emprisonner, vous convertir, vous voiler, vous enterrer, vous couper la tête, etc. Donc, on est toujours pris dans ce cycle-là qui fait que la question de la démocratie, de la liberté, du progrès devient une question secondaire. On est obligé à choisir un bourreau, on est obligé de choisir un protecteur. Et cette équation entre liberté, démocratie égale chaos et régime égale stabilité égale sécurité et islamiste égale menace. Et on tournera dans cette géographie. Et on n'arrive pas à définir qu'est-ce que la démocratie dans le monde arabe. Alors qu'est-ce qu'on fait? On se soumet ou on s'exile.
Yeah. Just also for my clear understanding, and I think it's important to ask this question in places where there's quite some hatred towards the immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East, etc., and not only from those places. Where does Islamism end and the Islamic religion start? How do we define Islamism? And I know this might be a difficult question, opposed to being just a believer. Is it possible to distinguish?
J'ai écrit dans ce roman, le personnage dit une phrase, la religion c'est un transport collectif, mais moi je préfère aller vers Dieu tout seul et à pied.
Ouais.
Et je crois que c'est ce qui fait la différence. La différence, pour moi, elle est dans le fait que l'islamisme c'est un projet de domination politique. L'islam c'est une religion que l'on peut choisir pour s'expliquer le monde, la mort, la naissance, etc. La différence, elle est dans le fait que la spiritualité et la religion, plutôt la spiritualité, c'est une façon d'aller vers Dieu. Et la religion, c'est une façon de croire l'avoir trouvé et de l'imposer aux autres. Je crois qu'il y a un projet politique qui est net, c'est celui de dominer la société, de la convertir, c'est le projet de l'islamisme, qui est différent du projet de l'islamisme en Occident. Et puis, il y a une religion qu'on peut pratiquer, à laquelle on peut croire, qui peut nous suffire pour expliquer le monde, qui peut être la quête d'une vie, mais qui est quelque chose d'intime. Je suis profondément laïque. Je crois qu'il faut séparer la religion et l'État, pas uniquement pour l'État, mais ça protège mieux la religion. Parce que quand on est laïque, la religion est protégée des ambitions politiques. Elle devient un acte intime, un acte de foi. Mais quand on mélange l'État et la politique, ça vous donnera des papes, des califes, des théocraties, des prêcheurs, des imams, des popes, etc. Des gens qui disent que je peux parler au nom de Dieu parce que j'ai son numéro de téléphone, il m'a parlé ou il m'a envoyé un SMS.
Yeah, I like that idea very much, that you can walk towards God alone. I think that's a beautiful image. Lana, in your letter, after you heard about the death of Dubravka, you wrote a sentence, but language failed me again. And I was wondering, for an author or for anybody, is it language that's failing? I mean, isn't this an easy way out, if I may say so? You mentioned the word genius before. Are you sure that you were not the one who was failing? Why was it language?
Yeah, I was referring to a quote by Margaret Atwood, who said, war is what happens when language fails. Language, of course, not as our ability to be eloquent, but our ability to communicate. And in this, for me, of course, this was something very personal, the inability to translate into this very fragile medium that we use, that is the language. It's not a perfect medium. It's always a translation. To convey this sense of loss. But I think the best we can do as writers, as artists, is to give it a go. We try, and sometimes we fail, but it's in this attempt to communicate something that I think our work makes sense. Yeah.
But of course, the fragility of language, that's the same for anyone who uses language, not only
Definitely.
For authors. And maybe because of this fragility, or maybe because of the shortcomings of language, we can communicate at all. Yeah. There's this quote by Jacques Lacan, which I like very much, and I've used it often, that where the misunderstanding starts, the communication begins.
Yeah.
So.
Definitely. But that is exactly, this attempt to explain yourself. And I wrote about it in my letter, how this love is this idea of the radical acceptance of difference, is, acknowledging the person across of you, or a different political party or a different, race, religion, and saying, okay, I want to understand, is going to be hard. And the only thing we have are words, which already are so, politically pregnant. Just the fact that we are speaking English here, that also has its right.
It's not neutral. No,
yeah.
Of course not. No.
So yes, I mean, it's. But I don't. I never think about. Again, when you say, is it us that are failing and not the language? That again would be a question of ego. So I don't think of again, what is this saying about me? But just trying to find the words, in this case, something that was very personal, but we can bring it on a bigger level. Just how can I express myself without overshadowing someone else? Yeah.
I found it interesting that you just said we only have language. No, we only. And thinking of what Kamel said before about the body, wouldn't you say that we also have that there is a world outside language? And
yeah, definitely. I was referring to writers that we have, our material is language, but I really loved almost everything that Kamel said could be used to explain the situation in Bosnia, what has happened to the state of womanhood after the fall of Yugoslavia and during the war, and actually how a woman's body has gone back to being property of the state in a way. We went from being...
Can I ask you, excuse me for interrupting you, if you say this, are you only referring to Bosnia and Herzegovina, or are you referring to Slovenia, to Serbia, to Croatia, to all the former Yugoslavian republics?
I'm definitely referring to the whole region, but since I spent most of my life in Bosnia, I feel like maybe it would be fair to refer to it, and also because probably that the worst bloodshed that we had happened there. And there was, this thing of my grandmothers had more freedoms than my mother. So there was as nationalism walked in, women went back to being bodies to produce more of the nation, to give birth to more Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, etc. So
they could fight in the next war.
So they could fight in the next war, and exactly what Kamel was saying, we went back to being somebody's mothers, daughters. I personally was attacked by a powerful man in Belgrade because of my writing, and he attacked me by actually addressing my father, saying, "You did not raise her well," which to me was very interesting. And he used a hyphen to talk about me. He said, daughter hyphen poetess, daughter hyphen writer. And it made me think about how we, as women, we live in this hyphen. We are in this hyphenated space, and we are never ourselves. So yes, there's definitely
we women everywhere. Would you say this is also valid for women living in Amsterdam, or?
I've only been here for 3 days, so I wouldn't.
But you spent some time in Spain, no?
Yes, yeah. 7 years.
Yeah. That's not a mistake.
Could I
so
tell
happy.
you about?
Okay.
Could I tell you about Spain? But yes,
I gave Oksana 5 minutes. I should give you at least the same. No, but
no. I don't want to take too much of your time. But yes, I could definitely see. In Spain, you have the situation. Again, I feel like if we're going to talk about Europe and democracy, we have to think about the things we are forgetting. For the past 3 years in this program, I've heard at least 4 people talk about 90s nostalgia. They miss the 90s. 90s was a utopia. And it makes me angry.
I know.
As you know from my letter. It makes me angry because, there was a genocide in my country in the 90s. Are we not Europe? Are we not European? Or are we not people? The same way, in Spain, we keep forgetting that a fascist dictator died peacefully in his sleep and is still celebrated today. There are flowers on his grave. And his people from his party just basically changed their clothes into democratic Hugo Boss suits and started the People's Party, which then ruled for a very long time. And there is a fascist legacy in Spain. So I feel like sometimes Europe today is built on forgetting, or just this, I don't know if it's intentional, or if it is a position of privilege.
I wrote in my letter that the war in Yugoslavia is largely, and that's made Oksana quite angry,
exactly.
But also maybe to defend the forgetters a bit. Isn't it also very human to forget?
Well,
Can we expect to remember all the catastrophes all the time?
You know, the problem is when you forget, especially something that happened so recently, it can happen again. So I don't think we are allowed to forget. Forgetting again is a privilege. You can forget. People in Bosnia cannot forget. Perhaps one day there will be a European panel where people will talk about how they missed the 20s, because somebody will forget about Ukraine. I assure you there will be people who will forget about it.
Of course,
This is why, exactly, it's already started. So it's a position of privilege.
Okay.
Being able to forget means that you're privileged enough to forget.
I agree, but then I'm not sure if remembering is a guarantee that things won't be repeated, to be honest.
We have to start with just talking. There are still many people in former Yugoslavia who have not even faced their own responsibility. So how can we even begin to remember and then hope to forget if we are not even facing
the past?
The past, yeah.
Kamel, another quote from your letter. The second reason you wrote why I like the metaphor is that in a swingers club you sometimes encounter voyeurs, a solitary species that comes to watch in silence, a bodiless witness to the body of another. That's how I have always seen myself when I travel in the West, a voyeur of European democracy, prohibited from touching an estate, an admirer, an outsider. I would say that by nature the novelist, the writer, is an outsider, and maybe also, I mean, sometimes I use the metaphor of spy, but I like the word voyeur a lot. What makes you a different voyeur from your colleague voyeurs? I'm not sure if Lana would say that she's a voyeur. Are you a voyeur? Sorry? Are you a voyeur?
What year?
A voyeur. A voyeur.
Voyeur. Well, I think we all are.
Yeah, we all. Yeah, we all are. So what's the difference? What makes you? I mean, you come from another world, and you are watching not only the bodies but European democracy. You said here.
J'ai toujours rêvé d'exercer un métier qui n'existe pas, qui s'appelle occidentaliste. C'est-à-dire, les orientalistes existent du 19e au 20e siècle. Ils vont au Moyen-Orient ou en Orient, ils regardent, ils dessinent, ils cherchent des mystères, ils cherchent des réponses. C'est un métier qui s'est éteint, je pense, à la fin du 20e siècle. On n'a plus d'orientalistes. J'ai toujours voulu être un occidentaliste, c'est-à-dire venir chez vous, observer vos mœurs, vos façons de manger, vos croyances, et essayer de les juger avec la même supériorité, peut-être, ou du moins égalité. Donc, c'est en ceci que je suis voyeur. Je crois que c'est quelque chose qu'on ressent tous lorsqu'on vient du Maghreb et quand on arrive ici dans vos pays où les choses sont très belles et tellement belles qu'on a envie de les posséder, mais on sait que ce n'est pas possible. Donc on regarde, on lit, on touche, peut-être pas, on achète, on apprécie, on mange et puis on repart. C'est cette sensation d'être un fantôme à chaque fois que je viens dans vos pays. Alors quelle est la différence entre témoin, voyeur et espion? Espion, je pense qu'on est payé. Pour témoin, on est convoqué dans un tribunal pour ajouter son témoignage à une vérité ou à son contraire. Mais voyeur, c'est quelque chose d'esthétique, c'est quelque chose de très fantomatique. Donc on vient, on observe, par exemple pour la guerre d'Ukraine, comment l'Occident, l'Europe parle de la guerre d'Ukraine, comment l'Europe, pour moi c'est fascinant, comment l'Europe veut gagner la guerre sans tirer un seul coup de feu, ou bien comment gagner sans faire la guerre, ou bien comment justifier son monologue de déserteur. Parce qu'on a l'impression que vous êtes tous des déserteurs en Europe face à l'Ukraine et que chacun cherche une justification d'une manière ou d'une autre. Donc c'est très fascinant pour moi de venir ici, de regarder, de voir aussi que parfois il y a des débats qui sont peut-être importants. Je n'ai pas à les juger. Sinon, je les juge tout seul quand je suis dans l'intimité. C'est des débats futiles. Est-ce que la démocratie existe en Europe? Oui. Il suffit de venir en Algérie ou en Égypte pour savoir qu'elle existe. Est-ce que l'écologie, on peut faire avancer la cause de l'écologie en collant sa main sur un tableau? C'est assez fascinant de voir un petit peu comment la démocratie en Europe, elle est à la fois fragile, à la fois esthétique, à la fois ridicule et parfois comique, et comment elle est aussi nécessaire. Donc tout ça fait de moi un voyeur. C'est quelqu'un qui vient ici, qui regarde un petit peu cette démocratie, comment elle se décline, et j'essaie un petit peu de réfléchir sur moi-même à travers ça, comme le faisaient les orientalistes européens qui réfléchissaient sur eux-mêmes à travers le Moyen-Orient ou l'Orient.
There's this book by Ian Boorman, Avishai Margalit, you might know it, Occidentalism. That exactly describes a bit what you are describing by coming from Algeria, for example, and looking at a mythologized Europe. My question about this. Well, first, let me say something about your question about how can Europe think that it can win the war in Ukraine without fighting. I mean, after 1945, now the ideology in Europe became that fighting was something we don't do anymore. We let Americans fight.
Exactement. Exactement, c'est fascinant parce que chaque fois que j'écoute un débat sur l'Ukraine en Europe, c'est toujours la même question qui revient. Comment gagner sans faire la guerre? C'est-à-dire comment faire la guerre sans tirer un seul coup de feu. Et c'est très fascinant. J'écoutais tout à l'heure le débat, l'intervenante sur l'Ukraine, et je voyais cette Ukraine qui a deux fronts finalement. Elle a un front Est qui est militaire, c'est-à-dire contre la Russie, et elle a un front Ouest vis-à-vis de l'Europe. C'est comment rappeler l'universalité comme vocation à l'Europe. Comment lui rappeler que l'Ukraine, ça fait partie de l'Europe ou d'autres pays encore. Comment rappeler que chaque guerre est la guerre de tout un chacun, de chaque personne, de chaque pays. Et donc, il y a comme deux fronts. Il y a un front militaire et un front idéologique, intellectuel, philosophique. C'est rappeler à l'Europe ce qui était sa vocation pendant des siècles et ce qu'elle tend à oublier. C'est son universalité. Et c'est très fascinant parce que on voit tout le piège du XXe siècle. L'Europe qui a inventé la guerre chirurgicale et qui quelque part, elle a validé la colonisation chirurgicale. C'est-à-dire, c'est parce qu'on s'exclut de l'universalité qu'on est un petit peu à la fois déculpabilisé, exonéré, mais en même temps, on est appelé. On est appelé à une vocation. L'Ukraine, elle pose une question d'universalité à l'Europe. Est-ce qu'on assume tout ou est-ce qu'on se débarrasse de tout? Est-ce qu'on est responsable de tout, et donc il faut aller jusqu'au bout, ou est-ce qu'on n'est pas responsable de toute l'humanité, et donc on laisse faire jusqu'au moment où on perd sa propre humanité. Donc c'est un peu une question centrale pour les Européens. Actuellement, je suis fasciné par leurs réponses. Comment chacun essaie de répondre. Un président européen m'a dit un jour que la véritable question pour chaque pays européen, c'est lorsque arrivera l'ennemi, combien vont fuir et combien vont rester pour le défendre.
But as you know, in the 30s, people in France said, pourquoi mourir pour Gdansk? And today, why dying for Danzig? And today, of course, the question is, why dying for Kiev, or why dying for Mariupol? And also the question is, I mean, if you want to engage in a war, you have to be willing to shed blood, your own blood, the blood of your own soldiers, and the blood of the enemy. And I'm quite sure that neither France, nor the Netherlands, nor Germany, despite all the investments in defense and in the army, are willing to do that. And also the question is, how do you ask young people to die for a cause that they might not believe in? I've been to Ukraine last year, and I spoke there to young men who told me, of course, we hate Russia and we want to defeat Putin, but I myself, I'm too young to die.
Mais tout le monde est dans ce combat. C'est une question que je me pose à moi-même. Est-ce que je dois rester vivre en Algérie ou est-ce que je dois partir m'installer à Amsterdam? C'est une question, elle est intime, je pense. Bon, elle peut être nationale, elle peut être transnationale, elle peut être continentale, elle peut être politique, mais au fond, la question du courage, de la lâcheté, c'est une question intime. On a le droit d'être lâche et on a le droit d'être courageux. Je ne la pose pas en termes de devoir. Je suis moi aussi un enfant de la guerre civile en Algérie dans les années 90. Et les années 90 n'ont pas été des années disco pour moi ou des années de grands groupes musicaux. La guerre civile en Algérie des années 90, c'est 200 000 morts au minima, 1 million de déplacés, des massacres atroces. Et donc, ce n'est pas la belle décennie. Et je peux vous dire qu'à l'époque, j'ai découvert ce qu'on ne devrait pas découvrir à 20 ans, c'est le cadavre des autres. Et donc, c'est des questions qui se posent à tout un chacun. Est-ce que rester, c'est du courage ? Je ne sais pas, parfois je me dis que s'exiler demande plus de courage que de rester. Est-ce que partir, c'est de la lâcheté ? On ne peut pas en juger. Donc c'est une question qui se pose à tout un chacun, et chacun y répond à sa manière. Peut-être qu'au fond, la littérature, elle est faite de ça. Les grands romans, en fait, sont construits autour de cette question de courage. Chaque personnage, soit il fait quelque chose, il comble sa faille, soit il avance, soit il ne fait rien. S'il ne fait rien, ça ne donne pas un bon roman. S'il fait quelque chose, ça donne un bon roman. Et donc, c'est la règle pour écrire des romans. Est-ce que c'est la règle pour vivre ? Je ne présume pas des autres. Parce que j'ai vu en Algérie, durant la guerre civile, ceux qui étaient prétendus lâches devenir courageux, ceux qui étaient prétendus courageux devenir lâches. Et donc, on ne peut pas juger. Donc, c'est une question, vous n'avez pas à répondre. Est-ce que vous allez prendre les armes pour l'Ukraine ou pas ? Je pense que c'est le choix de chacun. On a le droit d'aimer et de défendre ses enfants et sa femme, ou même de s'aimer soi-même et de se défendre soi-même. Et on a le droit de mourir pour un idéal et d'aller combattre. Je ne suis pas quelqu'un qui aime la guerre. La guerre, il n'y a jamais de gagnant, on le sait. Enfin, on ne le sait pas tous, malheureusement, mais il n'y a jamais de gagnant. Et la guerre, ça ne s'arrête pas. La guerre détruit la possibilité de l'oubli et la possibilité de se souvenir. Elle nous empêche d'avoir cet équilibre entre le droit à l'oubli et le devoir de se souvenir. Elle nous empêche de vivre normalement, elle nous dépossède de nos propres corps, elle nous remplit de colère et elle nous fait fréquenter plus les morts que les vivants. Donc, je ne suis pas quelqu'un pour la guerre. Est-ce que si j'étais européen, ukrainien, est-ce que j'irais me battre pour l'Ukraine comme l'ont fait Hemingway ou d'autres pour l'Espagne ? Je ne sais pas. Je ne sais pas. D'ailleurs, je me méfie de la littérature engagée qui parle beaucoup de guerre. Entre Hemingway et Borges, je préfère Borges, par exemple. Donc, je peux vous rassurer, vous n'êtes pas lâche, vous n'êtes pas courageux, comme moi.
Yeah. Two questions again. Isn't maybe the position of the voyeur? Is this what is protecting you also from becoming too militant, too engaged? And the second question is, you said you are entitled, you have the right to defend yourself, your family, of course. But is leaving always, is going to another place always the act of a coward? Isn't the survival instinct something that we should more value? And that we are also entitled to being a coward and to run away, instead of having the feeling that we should defend something like our place, our country. If not here, maybe we can go somewhere else and their life is better.
C'est possible. Enfin, je suis voyeur en Occident. Dans mon propre pays, j'essaie d'être quelqu'un d'autre. Je ne veux pas dire que c'est être héroïque de vivre en Algérie. Les femmes qui choisissent de s'habiller d'une certaine manière le matin, qui choisissent de porter une jupe et pas le voile, sont plus héroïques que moi. Et les femmes en Iran sont plus héroïques que nous tous ici. Donc, je ne peux pas dire que je suis quelqu'un qui ne fait rien. Parfois, le style devient politique parce qu'on n'a pas le choix. Parce que tout ce qu'on veut, c'est avoir une table, un micro et un endroit où on peut manger quelque chose tout en écrivant des romans. Mais parfois, on n'a pas de table, parce qu'on n'a pas de sol, parce qu'on n'a pas de pays. Donc on est obligé de commencer par avoir un pays, pour avoir un sol, pour avoir une table, pour avoir un café, pour pouvoir écrire. Donc le style, c'est ça en ce qui est politique. Donc je suis voyeur en Occident, certes, je suis un corps dans mon propre pays. Par contre, la deuxième question, pardon, comme vous dites.
You answered my questions, I think. I just, a last short question based on what you just said. Is it important to be heroic? Is it important? How important is it, if it's important?
J'ai ma propre réponse. Je pense qu'il faut mériter d'être un ancêtre pour ses arrière-petits-enfants. Il faudrait qu'ils se souviennent de vous avec quelque chose d'héroïque quand même. Il ne faut pas mourir totalement et absolument. Il Il faut laisser quelque chose de plus qu'une pierre tombale parfois, un bon souvenir. Et puis, il faut mériter d'être un père vis-à-vis de ses propres enfants. Quelle leçon je leur transmettrais si j'étais quelqu'un de lâche avec de bonnes raisons. Donc, on a le droit. Et puis, l'être humain, il est fait ainsi. Il y a des moments de bascule où on se croit lâche et on devient héroïque, où on se croit héroïque, on est lâche. Donc, on a l'instinct de la vie, on a l'instinct de la survie, et parfois, on se sent appelé à être plus que soi-même, à faire quelque chose qui va vers l'autre. C'est ce qui fait notre humanité, peut-être, qui peut à la fois créer de concentration et peut créer aussi des héros. Donc, on a besoin de quelque chose de plus, le petit supplément qui fait que notre vie prenne du sens. Peut-être que toute notre vie ne peut prendre du sens que lorsqu'on lui ajoute le 10% d'héroïsme à un moment donné. Et tout s'éclaire, et tout devient cohérent. Et on a l'impression qu'on a mérité d'avoir vécu. Donc l'héroïsme peut être une méthode aussi de guérir l'absurdité et l'inexplicabilité du monde. Peut-être qu'on est appelé à être un héros parce que c'est comme le sucre qu'on ajoute au café, parfois, ou comme la petite dose de quelque chose, et ça nous permet d'avoir une vie un peu plus longue que notre vie comptée à la montre. Donc on a quelque chose de plus, le petit supplément. Peut-être que c'est ça, mais on ne peut pas le savoir avant. Il faut être en situation pour savoir qu'est-ce qu'on est véritablement. Ce n'est pas vrai d'imaginer... on peut le faire. Quand on est écrivain, on peut imaginer des situations, on peut penser aux autres, mais la véritable question, elle se pose une ou deux fois dans la vie et on sait qui on est. Elle s'est posée pour certains écrivains de l'ex-URSS. Est-ce qu'ils devaient partir ou rester? Est-ce qu'ils devaient quitter ou est-ce qu'ils devaient continuer à se battre? Elle s'est posée pour des intellectuels sous l'Allemagne nazie. Est-ce qu'il fallait partir ou rester? C'est une grande question. Et elle est même biblique. Il y a une figure que j'aime beaucoup dans les prophètes bibliques, c'est Jonas. C'est le seul prophète qui a dit non. Donc il a choisi de partir. Il a dit non, je ne fais pas cette mission, je quitte, je vais vers l'ouest, je vais vers Tarsis, je vais vers la mer, je m'occupe de moi-même. Et c'est tout. Bon, il a été rattrapé, ça a mal fini. Il a fini par être prophète, mais il faut être en situation pour savoir. Et l'Europe, elle est maintenant avec l'Ukraine en situation. On sait que l'Ukraine existe, et on sait que Netflix, c'est du cinéma. Donc on choisit entre l'Ukraine et Netflix.
That's a tough choice for many. I guess that many people will choose Netflix. And speaking about heroism, maybe a novel can be an act of heroism as well. Speaking about migration, moving from one place to the next, Lana, in your letter you wrote, I've always had a difficult relationship with identity tags based on geography. My first passport was Yugoslav, and my mother still keeps it in an old shoebox together with a type list of post-Chernobyl instruction for parents. In Croatia, we were Serbs, and so we had to leave because of Dubravka herself, described in her essays as pure Croatian air. Right around the time that she was being excommunicated by her fellow university professors and journalists for speaking out against nationalism. We were settling in Bosnia for much the same reasons. I was the Croat girl in Banja Luka because of my Zagreb accent. So many things, I think. Would you say that becoming the other, becoming the outsider, by moving to another place, this shapes your identity in a way, and also your identity as an author, that could not have been shaped by people who don't know, who don't experience whether it's a civil war in Algeria or the civil war, the war in Yugoslavia? Would you say that there's a distinction between authors who know this experience and authors who doesn't? Who don't?
Well, there is, this strange kind of envy that I've seen in some writers from the West, almost envious because we have this experience and have this, great book topic to sell. And I think, to be completely honest, I would exchange this book or any other book for peaceful childhood and for coming from a country that did not have a genocide. And I can only respect those writers who would exchange all of the books in the world for one human life. To me, this position of the outsider, this is something that even Virginia Woolf wrote about, how a writer always has to be both somehow on the inside and on the outside, right? You're part of something, but you're also looking at it. To me, I had the experience of being a minority in Croatia during ethnic cleansing and having to leave, and then being a majority somewhere else where the so-called my people were actually now committing atrocities. So I could see this history, you know, I could see how a story can always have many different sides. It's never black and white. And this brings us back to the question of heroism, which of course always comes from this, you know, the mythical structure of stories. What is a hero? How do we define? It's usually a he, and it's somebody who wants immortality by overcoming obstacles, right? But let's talk about what kind of immortality you can have. Let's talk about why do you have to be immortal for violence, for having participated in violence. I think that this is why I go back to the question of love, which I think has to be restored as an intellectual subject, because it is also a patriarchal thing that love has been, you know, brought down to trivial, so-called chick-lit. No, love is the deepest intellectual subject we can have. Mm-hmm. How do we teach love to boys? How did we teach love to those boys? To boys. To boys. Mm-hmm. How did we teach love to those boys whose fathers were, you know, and parents were suffering in the 40s, and then they grew up to become those boys who would commit genocide in the 90s in Bosnia? It's, again, you know, what there's this beautiful quote from Rilke, love hasn't been learned. And this is what I go back to. This, to me, is heroism. You know?
Loving somebody.
Loving your child, loving your son, loving your daughter, but loving the person, loving the person. And I know this sounds banal, but no, actually...
But isn't that, forgive me for interrupting, isn't that the easiest thing to do, loving your own child?
It should be. It should be, but we are failing. We have failed. We have generations of young men. I mean, last month in Belgrade, a 17-year-old boy took his father's guns, which are guns from the previous war, walked into a high school in Belgrade and killed 9 children. So again, I go back to love has not been learned.
But do you think, Lana, that love is the opposite of destruction and violence?
Of course. Yeah.
But that's not what literature is teaching us.
No?
No. In many novels...
Which literature? The canon?
The canon.
Well, we can have another discussion.
Okay, but that's teaching us, showing us.
I would disagree. Go back to Mrs. Dalloway. Go back to Mrs. Dalloway. Look what happens to Septimus Smith when he says communication is health and communication is key. And this is why the reason, of course, he's come from the war and he has PTSD, which back then didn't exist. The reason he takes his own life is that he feels like he can no longer communicate with his fellow beings. Okay. I would say there is literature that teaches.
Of course, I think we should not, and that's my mistake, and again I have to apologize for that. My third mistake today is that we should not reduce the canon to one message. But still, I would like to ask you, do you believe that if love is being taught correctly, that we would not have any genocide, any war, any violence anymore? And would you say that all the violence we had in the last century, now the genocide Oksana mentioned, everything, the civil war in Algeria, whatever, is because of a lack of love from parents to children? Is this what I hear you saying?
I'm not arrogant enough to assume I have the one simple solution for all these atrocities. But I do think that the patriarchal myth of the nation, of the power, of overpowering that who is weaker than you, is actually our failure in empathy, in understanding, and in love. And I think that, you know, it's a deep subject, it's a complex subject, and I think we have to bring back that subject to the table and stop seeing it as a trivial matter that women talk about.
But
when they're shopping.
Who I'm not sure if people really agree that love is such a trivial matter, but maybe that's also...
Well, you as a writer probably don't, you think of it on a deeper level, but when you think about, when you hear that something is it's a romance novel, or, it's talking about love. I haven't heard intellectuals on panels like this. Well, at least not for example, in the Balkans, it's usually men. Nobody talks about this. So this, of course, we can call it whatever we want, but the act of empathy, and this is where literature comes in, becomes important. The act of empathy, the act of, I quoted Alain Badiou in my letter, the act of listening to the difference, the act of disagreeing even. We are no longer able to disagree. We live in bubble societies fed by algorithms. We like one thing and then we get more of that. We talk to people who already think what we think, Mm-hmm. We preach to the choir. So when I say love, I'm talking about this radical acceptance of the other. Instead of persuasion, instead of overpowering.
Maybe next year this days in the Balie should be about love and not about democracy.
Definitely.
Before we open, because I see what time it is, the discussion to the public. In interviews, you mention often Nabokov's Lolita.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's a novel about love?
No, definitely not.
That's definitely not. What?
Absolutely not. What I think that novel does brilliantly shows the power and the privilege of narration. It shows you what happens when one party has the power of narration and the other one doesn't. And it also shows you what happens when eloquence becomes more important than love.
You started by this conversation by making a distinction between eloquence and communication. Would you say that your novel, Catch the Hare, it's in English?
Catch the Rabbit.
Catch the Rabbit. Strange that it's Haas, because Haas, not rabbit.
Yeah, that was intentional because we use one word for both. Yeah.
Is this about love?
An attempt, I guess, to learn love. Yeah.
To learn love. Yeah. So by writing novels, we can learn love.
I don't know if we as writers can learn it, but I mean, again, we have to try. Yeah, we have to try.
This is a good time again to open the discussion to the public. If there are questions, please say your name again and also to whom the question is being addressed. And I think we have 5 to 8 more minutes, Jancar, no? Yeah.
I'm so pleased that you mentioned that Lolita is not about love, because it has been seen as the love of a man for a young nymphette. And he destroys her, and it's just a story and Nabokov explained it also like that. So I think that war is being made on the back of women. They paid a high price for wars in Ukraine, in Yugoslavia, everywhere in the Arabic land. And I don't know, I want to write a letter to the United Nations to stop all the countries who stop women from going to school, from living their lives the way they want, and stopping men to put them in a kitchen.
What's your question?
Oh, yes, sorry. My question is, how do you do that? How do you stop? Because it's going backward. It's worse today than it was 10 years ago. My question is, how can we act so strongly that it doesn't de-escalate more?
Who wants to answer the question? Kamel, maybe? And is it worse? Is it getting worse? I mean, it's always... Is everything getting worse? Or would we want to live in 1923?
Je ne sais pas. J'ai des réserves. Je ne sais pas si les choses deviennent pires ou est-ce qu'on est mieux informé maintenant qu'il y a un siècle. Et est-ce que ce n'est pas la même barbarie qui s'exerce sur la condition de la femme? On le voit par exemple en Afghanistan. Il y a une phrase qui m'a bouleversé quand je l'ai lu dernièrement, une femme qui criait. Elle disait, j'allais dire qu'on nous traite comme des animaux, mais les animaux vivent mieux que nous parce que les animaux peuvent aller où ils veulent et nous, on ne peut pas. Donc on est quelque chose qui est au-delà du jugement qu'on a sur une condition animale. C'est quelque chose de beaucoup plus ténébreux. Donc est-ce que la condition de la femme a changé, peut-être en certains endroits par rapport à d'autres? Peut-être qu'il y a des acquis par rapport à d'autres époques, je suppose, enfin j'espère, enfin je le crois, de mon point de vue d'homme. Mais effectivement, je partage entièrement le fait que les guerres se font sur le corps et sur la condition de la femme. C'est la femme qui paye le plus. Les changements, les ruptures politiques, même en Europe, quand il y a une crise politique, généralement entre mouvements populistes et mouvements progressistes, gauche-droite, extrême-gauche, extrême-droite, on se retrouve toujours ramené à la question du corps de la femme. Est-ce que la femme doit être la mère de famille et le ventre qui assure la lignée et l'accouchement des enfants? Ou est-ce que la femme, Et on se retrouve toujours à débattre du corps de la femme, parce que c'est le lieu de la naissance, le lieu de la mort et le lieu des conflits. Donc, je préfère croire que les choses se sont améliorées en certains endroits. Mais il est fou, il est inhumain de dire que les choses n'ont pas reculé dans beaucoup d'endroits. Ce n'est pas vrai. On le voit dans le monde qu'on appelle arabe. On voit où est-ce qu'on est la condition de la femme maintenant. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire? Personnellement, je me fais aider par ma femme, qui est présente ici, pour prendre conscience de ma propre condition d'homme. Et il a fallu des années pour guérir, ou peut-être croire guérir ma masculinité. Et j'ai une fille que j'adore, et j'essaierai toujours de lui offrir un monde où elle vivra la propriété de son corps, elle vivra son ambition, elle ne vivra pas comme la moitié d'un être humain, elle ne sera pas jugée pour son sexe, mais pour sa compétence. Et c'est ce que j'espère le plus, parce que je suis un père qui essaie de se racheter aussi.
Yeah. Thank you. Lana, would you like to add something to this response?
I don't want to take time if somebody else has a question. I think Kamel gave a brilliant answer.
Okay.
But thank you for the question, yeah.
Yeah, I think, Jancar, I see a question over there. Yeah.
Hi. So this is a question for Lana. I liked how you mentioned the difficulty between crafting an identity when you've moved around so much and being an immigrant, and how that's difficult for a writer. It echoed something that I've read by Goran Stefanovski, Tales of the Wild East. And in that essay, he also says how, in a lot of the ways, some writers, especially from the West, are jealous of writers from former Yugoslavia about not having that kind of story that they can use and in the writing to arrive at some conclusions. What do you think about this kind of, say, extreme between forgetting about us completely, that we ever existed, that there was a war, that there was a genocide, that we suffered in the 90s, versus this, in a way, fetishization of the pain of, oh, yes, you have a story because you went through such a turmoil, and it's something that you can capitalize on and profit of in your writing?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question, and I actually mentioned some of this in the letter because I have found myself in situations where I had to play the Bosnian girl and would be completely reduced to the role of the, this poor child, tell us about the war. And to me, it's about claiming our right to tell our story when we want to tell it, the way we want to tell it, the language we want to use, not succumbing to this almost Hollywood-like narrative. And it's insane. I remember one time I was an intern at a film festival in Banja Luka. It's in north of Bosnia, where I grew up. And these international directors, young directors, came to the town. And Banja Luka being, the place where the majority of Serbs just performed ethnic cleansing of Muslim population, it didn't see much fighting. So these directors came with their cameras, and I remember one had a really big camera, and she was looking around, and she was disappointed, and she said, "But where are all the destroyed houses?" And I almost felt like telling her, "Well, I'm sorry that we have disappointed you." There's this idea of, war being this one thing, this one image. And then this is why I always try, and especially in my writing, to show the consequences, to show this element of radiation that you do not see in the news, to show that war is something that keeps happening 30 years later. And this is, not interesting enough. But again, as writers, I also feel like you could write a story, I don't know if you agree, but you could write a story about a flower, and it could tell you something about humanity if it's well done, if it's, if you do it well. The topic itself doesn't have to be
that important.
I don't know if you agree, but
I must say I'm a bit shocked by this jealousy, but I guess people like to be jealous, and they find always a reason to be it. But one follow-up question to what's wrong with Hollywood?
What is wrong with Hollywood?
If I may, yeah. What does it mean? If you use the word, of course, Hollywood, what does it mean? What does it stand for?
In the way I used it, I was referring to this idea of the war story, with heroes, with bad guys, with a beautiful woman being raped somewhere. So these images that you think of when you think of, I was again talking about the narrative structure that perhaps is not going to be that entertaining.
Okay. But for example, Oksana gave us a story about the war that was also very much a division between the good guys and the bad guys. A very clear division. And I would not say that that was Hollywood. Or maybe it was. Okay.
No, of course not.
No. Let's go to the last question, I guess. If there's two more, we can do two more. Maybe the lady over there first, on the third row, in white.
Thank you, and I will make it quick. And my question will be for Lana, and maybe you can answer it actually in a, Facebook post or anything, to save the time. But I really want to send you 1 million of pluses, for what you've said about love, because I'm Ukrainian, and we're facing now the most recorded and media depicted war, because everybody has a phone and can tag it. And for us, to be honest, one of the biggest horror was to listen to the conversations of the Russian prisoners of war when they were giving a phone to call their wives and to call their mothers. And the way those women talked to them, that is the answer, I think, for what you're saying, importance of loving your children, because they didn't want them, it was all about where the money is, for their, the reward of where they're coming back. So I think that if we all bring up our children in love, and if our children feel loved and needed, those people are just not going to end up at somebody else's territory shooting women and children for no good reason, and they will think about it twice. And my question would be to you, as you mentioned, I have a teenage daughter, so now we're facing a generation of Ukrainian children and teenagers who've been either on occupied territories or, faced bombings like my child, or now as refugees. In your post, or maybe now, any advice for us as mothers of how to make it easier for them would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I would like to comment on this idea, if we love our children, because there have been war criminals who were probably very much loved by their parents or had lovely childhoods.
And it's a bit of a strange idea that Russian soldiers are on Ukrainian territory because their mothers love.
No, of course we should never, we shouldn't always look for just one reason, but maybe think of it in a more complex way. But it's not just about showing them love, it's about teaching them love. To me, there was a clear moment in my childhood when my fellow, friends from my school were no longer just children, but were suddenly Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. And this moment where children are no longer children, but are Muslim, this is where, you are not taught love well. If you are taught to see somebody. So it's not just about showing love, I think it's about Do you have something to say?
I've a question for you. If you say you can teach love, doesn't this imply that you know what love is? And is this position not already a powerful position? Where you say, I know what love is, and here are my disciples, and I'm going to teach them how to love in a good way.
Imagine that. Maybe I would finally have a job and a personal assistant.
And a personal assistant, exactly.
I mean, I don't, think I have the monopoly over that definition, and I don't think that there is one way of doing it. But it doesn't mean that I cannot see that it hasn't been done well. Yeah, and I think just the fact, for example, that I grew up during war, and there was no such thing as child psychologist, for example. Nobody talked to us about what was happening. It was just off the table. And we were supposed to know, we are the good guys, they're the bad guys. And again, there was a huge myth. Because, in the 14th century, the Turks came and I don't know what. We were given this very simplified story. But again, we were not taught to look at people as people. So maybe just like starting there without turning it into a program. And just to answer your second question, because you are a parent, and it makes me think of my mother back then, what to do. I think just don't ignore the elephant in the room. Talk about things, and just try to also don't be too hard on yourself.
That's always a good advice.
You're doing the best you can given the circumstances. So. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
We go to the last question. I hope it's a good one.
No pressure.
Yes. Alors maybe I'm going to express myself in French because I'm French.
Yes, please.
So,
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk to Kamel Daoud. Voilà, déjà c'était très intéressant le fait d'être dépossédé de son corps, ce côté un petit peu d'inconfort finalement dans cette société, et également le fait qu'il y ait une certaine confusion par rapport au pouvoir sur vous parlez de l'islam, enfin bon, c'était très intéressant. Ma question était plutôt à savoir aujourd'hui, par exemple, lorsqu'on entend, là je parle de Tariq Ramadan ou des philosophes ou économistes parlant sur un islam modéré, est-ce qu'il ne serait pas intéressant justement de voir un petit peu les choses différemment sur cette compréhension par rapport à l'islam, par rapport à la position de la femme, qui aujourd'hui, il y a quand même une progression dans les façons de penser justement. Vous ne le voyez pas, vous ne le percevez pas de cette façon-là
Non, juste dans quelle géographie, je veux dire.
Pardon
Où
Non, je parle d'une perception globale, justement, par rapport à l'islamisation, par rapport à la position de la femme. Il y a des questions aujourd'hui récurrentes qui sont quand même... Il y a des questions qui viennent, en fait, qui amènent des débats, qui n'amenaient pas de débat avant. Par exemple, lorsque Tariq Ramadan parlait de la lapidisation de la femme, il y a un sujet qui a été remonté, il y a quand même des questions aujourd'hui qui se posent. Vous n'avez pas l'impression qu'il y ait quand même une modération ou plutôt une certaine compréhension de plus en plus dans ce monde-là par rapport à la personne? Justement, c'est une question un peu compliquée, mais par rapport à ce monde islamique, justement, ou la position de la femme. Vous comprenez ma question?
Non, si j'ai bien compris, vous me
si
posez
on
la
arrive
question.
à une islamisation modérée ou une certaine compréhension, vous voyez?
Ok, merci pour la question. C'est une question qui se pose dans le monde qu'on appelle arabe, je pense, depuis 2 décennies. Est-ce qu'un islamisme ou un islam modéré existe? Je ne sais pas s'il y a une évolution des discours en Europe. C'est ce que je crois. Je crois que l'islamisme occidental européen s'est adapté. Ça, c'est ma conviction. Je peux me tromper, mais je crois que l'islamisme, ici en Occident, s'est adapté à la fois à la culpabilisation, à la culpabilité de l'Occident, à la démocratie aussi, dans le sens où il en profite, à l'idée de liberté, dans le sens où il la parasite parfois, Donc, je fais ce que je veux, je récuse mon corps parce que je suis libre. Je porte le voile parce que je suis libre. Est-ce qu'au nom de la liberté, on a le droit d'interdire ou d'autoriser le voile? Ce sont des questions. Mais quand on vit en Algérie, je suis désolé. Ce que je vois, c'est un recul, c'est un désastre. Ce sont des débats maintenant qui sont en net recul par rapport à ce qui se disait sur la condition de la femme dans les années 70-80. Peut-être pas dans les milieux ruraux, mais dans les milieux urbains. Donc, je suis désolé, je ne vois pas d'évolution. Je vois au contraire un recul qui est à la fois le propre d'une société patriarcale, du conservatisme religieux, mais aussi des femmes qui sont convaincues de ce statut second. Parfois dans la vie, quand on n'arrive pas à échapper à une prison, on se fait le gardien de la prison. Et donc, parfois, on retrouve même les femmes qui défendent le droit, ou plutôt le droit des femmes de ne pas avoir des droits. Donc, je ne vois pas d'avancée. Ce que je vois en Occident, c'est une adaptation de l'islamisme européen à un discours de médiatisation un peu soft qui fait passer des choses, plus ou moins, qui autorise le communautarisme, qui autorise la réclusion, l'enfermement sur soi au nom de l'identité, au nom de la spécificité culturelle, etc. Mais je suis désolé, je ne vois aucune évolution lorsqu'on voile une femme, lorsqu'on lui laisse juste l'autorisation de laisser voir ses yeux. Je ne vois pas d'évolution quand on se met à défendre une sorte de ségrégation sexuelle au nom de la spécificité culturelle ou communautaire. Je ne vois pas d'avancée. Lorsque les jeunes filles des troisième génération de migrants se retrouvent plus islamistes que leurs grand-mères qui sont arrivées il y a 40 ans, je ne vois pas d'évolution. Et encore pire, dans le monde qu'on appelle arabe, je ne vois pas d'évolution. Je vois une régression qui me fait peur, au-delà de l'écrivain ou du journaliste, elle fait peur au père que je suis. Je ne voudrais pas que ma fille subisse ça. Pour résumer, je suis quelqu'un qui vit là-bas. Je pense, comme tous les Algériens, parfois à partir, mais la réalité, je suis resté. Mais je ne voudrais pas que ma fille reste. Je ferai tout pour qu'elle parte. Je ferai tout pour qu'elle soit libre, qu'elle dispose de son corps, qu'elle choisisse un Dieu ou un mari, ou les deux à la fois. Mais je ne suis absolument pas d'accord pour dire qu'il y a une évolution. Il y a une évolution de discours trompeur ici, et il y a une régression de la condition de l'autre côté. Ça, c'est la réalité. Elle est dure, elle nous fait mal à notre image narcissique, parce que quand on est maghrébin, on n'aime pas que, surtout les Européens, aient une idée un peu supérieure sur notre culture, ça nous blesse notre ego. D'ailleurs, c'est ce qui fait notre censure communautaire. Oui, c'est vrai, mais il ne faut pas le dire. Mais la réalité, elle est là. Nous faisons souffrir nos femmes, nos filles, nos mères, nos enfants, notre société, et nous reculons sur la liberté et la condition de la femme. Ça, c'est la réalité. Le reste, ce sont des politesses.
Thank you. Thank you, Kamel. Merci. Thank you, Lana. Thank you, Kamel. It was a wonderful discussion. We'll be back next year, and then we talk about love. To you, dear people in the audience, thank you for your patience. You know now that you have to love better. And if I may give you an advice, go to the bookstore and buy Lana's book or buy Kamel's book. That's not an act of capitalism. That's an act of pure love. Also, thank you. This last thing, because speaking about love, I'd like to mention the translators. I love them deeply. And they're underloved. And their names, I hope I pronounced them rightly, Andrei Ryansky and Philippa Burton. Yes? Thank you so much. And